So today we have a very special guest who happens to be my neighbor here in Worcester Park in London, and we bumped into each other during a talk that I delivered recently, and I immediately recognized him. You know, it's like, I know you from somewhere, and lo and behold, we were neighbors, and we got off to some like really interesting conversations, which now I'd like to capture one of those on this podcast. And today we want to talk a little bit about car industry, specifically automotive industry, and really delve deeper into what's going on there, what has been really already going on, as well as what might be going on in the future, and how what sort of wisdom from the business side we can pick up from there. First things first, John, let's hear a little bit of introduction about who you are, because I don't like to introduce people. You know yourself the best.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess in one respect, I'm not a hardcore car industry kind of guy. By that, I've not been in the car industry for years and years and years. Yes, I was brand ambassador for the Nissan GTR for a point. I was part of the French car manufacturer Alpine's launch or relaunch into the UK, which was a fantastic project to be involved in. But I was also a founder member and for the first 10 years chairman of quite a prestigious car club, and we had members around the world. We had official recognition from the manufacturer, and then I went off and ran quite a significant, in terms of numbers, we had 3,000 cars, car show in the UK, and ran European driving tours. So I'm a kind of car guy by passion, and ended up also being a car guy by profession. And even now I'm still involved in an event called Auto Royale, which is a very prestigious concours event coming to the UK soon. So passion, profession, but certainly cars, yeah.
That's a classic humble English brag, as far as I'm concerned. So what is, like, tell us so that we'll follow this model that's on my picture here. And first things first, like, what is the actual purpose of car and automotive industry in your view these days? Because, like, in the past, I would have always thought, and Mo, please chime in here, I would have thought that cars were about, an automotive industry was about getting people from A to B, but actually really in practice it seems to be about like showing off, really, more than anything. What is the purpose today in your view of that industry?
So you're absolutely right. A car is a device to achieve a certain objective, okay, but it comes with it a whole load of social elements as well. Yes, it's used to show off. Different cars attract different types and natures of people. That it has different bragging rights. Ian Callum, who's the ex-chief designer at Jaguar, said there's no such thing as bad cars, just bad car companies. And that's really interesting because we all think of beautiful Italian exotic cars or wonderful British classic cars, and absolutely, they are brilliant things. Some of them are actually pretty dreadful to drive, let's be honest. But whether it is the cheapest thing that you can buy on the lot, it's still actually probably a pretty good car. Any modern car, the cheapest one you can buy, if you think about the technology that's in there, it's a world away from the technology of 20 years ago in terms of a car. So cars themselves are fantastic devices. We all have our favorites. We all have reasons for buying them, whether that's to how, the emotion it stirs when you're driving up the gravel driveway to stay in a beautiful hotel for the weekend and go to a wedding, or what it looks parked outside China White. It doesn't matter, right? It all attracts an emotional an element to it, and that's key in the customer buying psyche. But the car industry itself is a fundamentally different thing. The car industry is like any other industry. It's very competitive. It finds its niche in the market. It tries to produce the best product, the most efficient product. But beyond that, actually, cars is a hugely political thing because of the sheer scale of it. Germany, 800,000 people work in the car industry. In Japan, 8% of the entire workforce work in the car industry. And then you get France, 500,000 people, USA, 10 million jobs. So from the car manufacturing industry, it's huge. It's political, and that in itself is the problem.
So in that sense, then the people aspect of the industry is not just manufacturers and engineers of the cars and buyers and dealers, but it's also a government that's playing part in this whole thing, because this is like a whole supply chain and then some, right? So tell us a little bit more from your years of experience, because I always have this kind of idea of what it's like, but then there's my idea and then there's a kind of reality. Who are the people involved in this process?
Sure. I mean, there are certain countries that are very deeply entrenched in the automotive industry. The UK certainly used to be. It's not now. The UK car industry employs some 40,000 people. It's nothing like it used to be. But we're still very passionate about the British brands, and Aston Martin stands out, as the most significant one of those. But it's just the sheer impact of what is happening now to the car industry, what has been happening to the car industry, and that in itself is changing, and what the future means. It's at the point where no car company can fail, and I don't mean that in a too big to fail kind of banking kind of quasi reference. It's the sheer impact. In France, so just recently, Moody's downgraded 7 manufacturers in their credit rating. 7. That's the industry, if you like. Now, one of those was downgraded to junk. Okay, it's frightening, and that's a car manufacturer that employs about 200,000 people. Now, that's a challenge for the country, because it employs 200,000 people. It probably employs twice as many of that in the whole supply chain industry and the support industry and everything that goes with it. No matter how bad that company is, and the state owns a percentage of this company, they have to turn it around. They have to do something. And the problem is, there's too many cars. We are making too many cars. Year on year on year for 20 years near enough, the number of cars produced is going up. And until recently, that was a problem. Then China started to become quite a significant buyer, and the problem went away. The problem's back again, but the problem's back again, only bigger. And you're on this train of constantly trying to develop and improve, which has huge R&D costs. And at the end of all of this, you've got people whose jobs rely on it, and you've got people who are the customers, and they seem to be getting squeezed out. So in your comment about people are the biggest challenge for the employers and the government, but they're also the least important part of the process.
That's interesting. Mo is sitting in France. Have you noticed much change in attitude towards Renault as a company in France? What do French people think about Renault?
Well, I mean, they do have some good sports brands in that respect, but I think, and this is more of a generational comment, I think, our generations, I'm in my late 20s, doesn't really care that much about car ownership. For us, it's more about mobility, right? So for me, I still have yet to get my driving license, but I've mostly lived in cities throughout my life. I was living in London for 5 years, and I was always on the tube. The bus network is great. And even when I do get round to purchasing a car, I'm not really going to have a national pride buying consideration. It's really going to just be more about either something functional that gets me around that looks nice. So I have identified a few Peugeot models, but just as starters, or on the more luxury end, something German. But in that respect, I think we're in a generation now where basically people don't really care about buying a car like it used to be. I mean, you've got great transport networks. You have really more the environmental consciousness as well. And if you do want to not get in the tube, well, there's Uber for that. So that's my attitude towards it, at least in that respect.
But you're right. You talk about Uber. The valuation on Uber isn't based on how much money they earn as taxi drivers. It's based on the fact that they're collecting and gathering data, which will be available to people to use, manufacturers to be able to use, which is why people like GM are investing in those kind of companies. We now have driverless cars. We see driverless cars. The driver's still there, and there's still all the instruments. That will fade over time. The problem with driverless cars isn't the cars; it's the people. You still feel you need to grab the steering wheel. It's faith and trust. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We will move away from car ownership, and with things like PCP, we kind of almost have. But we're going to move away from car ownership. You've got big transport infrastructure programs in cities. You've got the government backing sort of Quango type organisations to make this a reality. And you'll jump in your little pod. They've got them at Heathrow Terminal 5. There is absolutely no reason why they can't run those through the city. Just some infrastructure in the streets to put them on, and you're away. Jump in your little pod, tell it where you want to go, away you go, get out the other end. No drivers. It's small enough to put 4 people and 2 bits of luggage in. So you can double the number of lanes and quadruple the number of cars on the road. That's the future. Reality is we're a long way away from that, and the people who are getting into that, if they're the car manufacturers, that's a fundamental shift, which is why you have companies like Tesla, which are valued now more than General Motors and Ford combined, because they're not a car company. Tesla is not a car company. It's a transportation company, which includes a number of elements: batteries, charging, and cars. So the world is changing, demands are changing. You're absolutely right, Mo. People don't want to own cars. Why buy something that's going to be worth less tomorrow than the day you bought it? It's a depreciating asset, and that too is because of oversupply.
So what? Yeah.
I was just going to make one final comment just before we move to the next theme. So, talking about people, John, you mentioned the change in habits. There's one company in France that's taken off, and I think now is actually at the unicorn status, called BlaBlaCar, which used to be called covoiturage.fr. And it's huge, right? Because basically what you're seeing is this, kind of sharing economy, where actually, even if you don't have transport links, you have now peer-to-peer intermediation and people sharing their asset with each other's on a use basis. So I think what's interesting as well is that, you get to meet people that are not necessarily from the same social background as you. I mean, I've traveled with people who are retired, guys in the army, person who's like a student. So I think also this fact of people not focusing so much on car, but just more like interconnection and mobility and, getting from A to B without really giving a damn about the rest. That's also a big social change we're seeing.
Yeah, and people are, if you've got an asset that's sitting on the driveway for most of the time, people are now renting them out. I can rent out my driveway, I can rent out my car, and it should potentially pay for itself. So yes, as a society, we're becoming less precious about ownership. Don't get me wrong, the people with the very beautiful, very expensive cars may still be very precious about it. But for the average car user, it's changed, and it will continue to change. The interesting thing right now with us traveling less, a lot more people working from home, that will evolve eventually into more people working from home, or should we say less people commuting daily to their office. And that will change the need and demand for cars. Currently, families with 2 cars will say, well, actually, we could reorganize ourselves and only have one. Families with a car will say, well, actually, we can rent it out during the day. And to your point, the car sharing, some families will get rid of cars. So the people element is interesting because it's actually going to create less demand. It's very early days, I know, but about a week ago in Germany, lockdown, they allowed car retailers to open again. And in the UK, they're now allowing car retailers to open, but not the showrooms. So you can go online, configure and order a car. It will be delivered to you. You can book your car in for a service. Car retailers are not, are getting organised for these people wanting their car serviced. So they're ahead of the curve. But the idea that you need to own a car is going away. So what they've seen in Germany, they've opened their stores on, I think it was the 20th of April. The footfall, if you can call it that, because it's online mainly, is down 60%. Less than half the people they're expecting to come in and go, I haven't bought a car for 2 months because I've been waiting to trade in my old one, and now I'm just not turning up. It's quite interesting. Whether that pans out long term, I don't know. I suspect it will never get back to the height it was.
So are there any other major changes in expectations from consumers that you're noticing, John? Because like things that come to mind, for example, there's been notion of like flight shaming that was arising like a year ago, where it's like, do you really need to fly to, I don't know, like Germany even, or, China to take that meeting that you could have taken on Zoom, and so on. Like, will there be some sort of thing around car shaming, as in, are you driving a gas guzzler? Do you really need that? Why can't you use something else that's a bit more maybe electric or less polluting or something like that? And, certainly in our area where we're living, those kind of SUVs and gas guzzlers have been very popular with mothers that are dropping kids off to schools and so on. Do you see that like continuing being as a sort of thing, or will people start kind of troughing off on that sort of demand?
That's an interesting question. I think you're seeing a positive rather than a negative. So the idea that people want to buy electric cars, hybrid electric, hybrid electric is by a country mile the biggest growing market sector in terms of new car sales. So you are seeing people embrace that in a positive way. You're not necessarily seeing any shaming going on. It'd be quite difficult, I guess, to shame someone who turns up in a £200,000 exotic sports car. But the big 4x4s, outside schools and all that kind of stuff, it's difficult to shame people when there's so many of them. So I think from a cultural point of view, it's much more a positive thing than a negative thing. But there is one thing to remember. He's just a fantastic idea. Per passenger mile, a horse, bearing in mind what it eats, etc., pollutes more than a Corvette.
Okay, interesting. That's like one of those stats that's like dinner conversation.
but it just shows you, it's not always really obvious, right? Some hypercars, some supercars are very efficient. Behind me there's a poster by a wonderful designer friend of mine. His new hypercar is going to be hybrid. But your average run of the mill backwards and forwards to the shops car isn't hybrid. So who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? It's not a simple black and white kind of thing.
So systems-wise, what was then happening at the beginning of 2020, and what are the challenges in the automotive industry now then?
So the automotive industry is there's a number of parts of the automotive industry, first of all, right? So you've got the manufacturers. Now the manufacturers are constantly churning out cars, investing in new technology, because they're being driven that way by people like Tesla. So they're having to embrace a lot of the new technology. A lot of this stuff is very expensive, which is why you see some of these big alliances coming together. The Renault-Nissan alliance last year, bought Mitsubishi, or 50% of Mitsubishi. Yes, because Mitsubishi needed the money at the time, but also they have no hybrid technology. They have battery technology, they have diesel, they have power. Electric, they have no hybrid. So rather than develop hybrid, why not go and buy someone who's actually probably one of the best at it? So there's a lot of that, but there's only so far that will go. And then you've got people, like Aston Martin are going to be using Mercedes-Benz engines because just the cost of development. You've got European emission regulations getting ever and ever and ever tougher, right? Which means more and more and more R&D. So the challenge for the manufacturers is just purely the scale of the challenges being set by the government and the competition. There's no way out, because we demand it because of the environment, because of our needs, and nobody can afford to fail because of the sheer numbers. Then you've got the finance people. A lot of them are owned by the manufacturers. That's a massive industry, and that matters because the finance is keeping the production line going, literally. But then you've got the retailers. Now, retailers most of them are big organizations. Yes, there are small retailers, but they're kind of stuck in a cleft stick. They've got declining demand, but they've got manufacturers constantly pushing product at them. So how do they do that? And it's challenging. So you've got a situation where Ford in the UK have said they're going to shut 200 dealerships this year, and they're forecasting they're forecasting a loss of 480 million. Pendragon have just announced 117 million loss for last year, and so it goes on, right? I can think of
what's Pendragon? What's that?
It's a big retailer, has lots of brands under it. So, so if the retailer's making loss and they're getting more and more and more product pushed at them, you're going to see failures. There's already been some. There'll be more, but it's a challenge. And then where this all comes together is the manufacturers. They want you to buy as the wholesaler, if you like, buy their product. So they put incentives in. So which is why you see special rates on PCP and you find dealer discounts and all these kind of special offers. So the margins therefore are being shrunk just to maintain this production. Last year as an industry, the second-hand car market made a loss in the UK because there's so many people trading in their cars. The dealerships needs to buy the car, or it's handed back because the end of the PCP has come to its end. The manufacturer really doesn't care about a car that's 2 years old. He's just made a new one. It needs to sell the new one. So you get examples where a customer walk into a dealership and it's cheaper to buy a new car than an old one. Yet there is nothing wrong with the old one. It just happens to be 2 years old and somebody else didn't want it. It's a crazy place to be right now in the automotive industry.
Wow. Right. So what about your views on tomorrow then, in terms of innovation and the changing technologies that are, taking place in this industry? Because I try and keep an eye out on this as much as possible. Obviously, Tesla comes a lot in my various feeds. They even though Elon Musk describes himself as a guy who's not a marketing guy, he always captures the attention. So what's going on? What's going to happen, going forward, and what's changing?
Gosh, yeah. If I knew the answer to that, I'd have people like GM paying me a heck of a lot of money. There's obvious things going to happen. The drive ever towards more efficient engines. In London, they want to ban diesels. It wasn't long ago that they were saying, "Hey, let's get everyone into diesels. They're more efficient." So nothing ever stays the same. There's a drive for ever more efficient engines. I think we need to change the way we record the emissions on a car. It's parts per million, not total parts. So a very big engine that's efficient is actually considered better than a small engine that's not efficient. Yet actually the small engine that's not efficient may be polluting less. So some of the regulations need to change. I think there is a drive more towards hybrid, more towards battery, but we need to find new technologies as well. Toyota have got this hydrogen fuel cell car, which is brilliant. It does need a battery, but the hydrogen is fantastic. That technology needs developing. The challenge with battery cars is the batteries themselves. The stuff that they make those batteries out of. There's not enough if half the world decided to go battery tomorrow. We couldn't get it out of the ground. There's just not enough. So where do we find all of the raw materials? Batteries degrade over time, which then somehow we have to dispose of this. So it has an environmental impact. So we haven't actually got the answer yet. We know what the problem is: too many cars, too much pollution, taking up too much space. And there are elements of that will improve the situation, but I'm not necessarily saying they're going to solve it. If we all got rid of cars tomorrow and had pods, it'd be great. If we all got rid of our cars and had a bicycle and only commuted 3 miles to work instead of 50 miles to work, that'd be great, but society won't stand for that. The simple challenge is there's no one fix. There's a lot of stuff that needs to change. The interesting thing right now is society is actually driving that change. And I'm not sure who's winning, but it's a long race, and we've got a long way to go and a lot of money to do it. Sorry.
John, so I'd like to bounce back on that actually. So you've mentioned, the different practices in terms of how we build cars, how we design them. But, as you said itself, a car is only an object. There's a whole ecosystem around it, right? Manufacturers, people, resellers. So I'd just like a bit more your comments in terms of like the social innovations you see, different practices we might see emerge, whether at industry level or in like individual social level. I say that this is so vast, but one example I've seen that benefits the manufacturer is the financialization of the car, right? So rather than the car being a physical asset that you buy, the car being a financial product with underlying collateral, which keeps people, like with iPhones, right? You get the iPhone, it works very well for 3 or 4 years, but you get into a contract where they'll offer you the upgrade after a year or two. And obviously, when you're looking at, this kind of new financial products, that's pure profit for them, essentially, because you've got a loan, it's very secure, you don't have all the intermediaries, because you're unlike, like a bank that would own its branches, well, you own or partner with the retailers that are selling that. So, outside of the financing, are there other trends that you're seeing? What does kind of the future on the social aspect look like?
So let's talk about financing first. And your comment about iPhone is interesting. In France, I don't know if they've brought in the laws yet, but about technology obsolescence and those kind of things. People throwing iPhones away that are 2 years old. That's just not good, right?
We're very good at making laws with tech giants. Right.
Okay. We'll leave that one there, right? But this idea of obsolescence is not it's not great for the environment. It's not great for the owners. The residuals on cars, you used to buy a car. When I bought my first car, I sold it 3 years later, and I didn't lose much money. Now, if I buy a car, by the time I've got it home, right, I've just lost tens of thousands of pounds, kind of thing. It's crazy. So, and that's this finance thing. Now, in terms of social trends, I think the very notion that you would buy something that's a depreciating asset, a significant spend, is a weird notion. So previously, it didn't have a significant depreciation. Now it does. One could argue that the finance is what's driving the depreciation, because it's now easier to get finance on a car, and it's easier to change. And go back to Jason's point right at the beginning about the social thing. Yeah, you want a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old car on the driveway, not a 7 or 8-year-old car on the driveway, and that's wherever you live, right? That's a social phenomenon that we have. So I think the social changes. There's one thing, Mo, in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, we should have a conversation about an advert you'll be hearing on the radio that said, "Where you missold PCP." All those adverts you hear about PPI right now, in 3 years' time, you'll be hearing about PCP. I genuinely think PCP will be the next PPI scandal for banks and finance houses.
Quick question. We keep hearing the word PCP for the uninitiated. What is that?
Yeah, what is PCP? Yeah.
So PCP is personal contract purchase. So it's a specific product for cars. It's like hire purchase. So the idea is you put a deposit down or not. You pay so much a month to, in effect, rent the car. And maintain it, and so on and so forth. At the end of it, you either hand the keys back, and there may be a balloon payment to pay, or there may be no settlement, or you depending on the how well you've looked after the car, or there's a balloon payment which you pay, and then you take ownership of the car. So it's rental and then purchase, or rental with a purchase option, PCP. So I think social change, that's going to be a big thing. I think there's going to be some interesting financial challenges around that, and people getting involved in that from a sort of reclaim point of view. Other social trends, I think, we are forever wanting the newest, shiniest thing. You talked about, iPhones, everyone wants the latest iPhone, everyone wants the latest whatever car, et cetera, et cetera. That's a human instinct. I don't think we'll change that. What we need to do is change the script, and the script needs to be, instead of "I got the newest car," it's like, "No, I don't own a car." And I think that will be the social change. I don't own a car, but I have access to one that's on a row of 7 or 8 of them, outside my local railway station, and I jump in it, and it drives me home, and it goes back again. I think that's the change. Socially, it's interesting. If I was advising someone on a career right now and they wanted to go and be a mechanic, I'd tell them not to bother.
Wow.
But there will always be mechanics, but just a lot less of them, I suspect. If you've got a child that's starting school, they'll probably never have a driving lesson. They probably won't ever own a driving license. They won't need to. So we've got to look to the children and think, what's their world going to be? What do they think transport is? If you've got a little kid, it's very simple. Transport is there's some bloke who sits in the front or some lady who sits in the front who drives me everywhere. It just happens to be mum or dad. That's not going to change, except instead of being mum or dad, it'll just be an empty steering wheel.
So quick question before we bounce on to the next theme. This is more, I would say, trivia, and it probably only concerns 0.1% of the population. You mentioned moving the script from, my car's 1 or 2 years old to I don't own a car. What about those of us who want to purchase a luxury car? What's it looking like socially there? Car buying club, or am I going to buy that car, have it sit in my driveway? I'm asking the important questions here.
Will Mo be shamed for owning an Audi?
Yeah. I've just got a future-proof there.
Mo, I can introduce you to someone at DS, all right? So you can buy a nice French car, although they will say that. Let's not get into that. It's interesting. So cars appeal to a number of things, right? Yes, it has a functional element, but it does also have an emotional tie as well. There are a reason why cars today feature very extensively on a lot of films, right? And Hollywood producers spend a lot of time getting the right car because it creates a certain image, And I was approached on a number of occasions for a GTR to feature in a couple of TV programs in the UK. And my first question was, who's the owner? Who's the driver? What character are they playing? And if they were a bad guy, no, we didn't want to be associated with the bad guys, right? So there will always be a car as a toy, as an expression of fun, as an expression of who you are. A classic old car, or a brand new, hypercar. What does that say about you as a person? So how will you own one of those? I think they'll become more and more expensive, but they will become investments. I bought a car many years ago and I sold it a few years later for 3 times what I paid for it because I happened to buy the right car at the right time. Now, it doesn't always happen. I've lost a lot of money on cars as well. But there are cars out there that are worth eye-watering sums of money. And that in itself then becomes a problem. You can't sell it because of the tax on it. So potentially car clubs, yes. But if you really are passionate about a particular brand, a particular mark, you might buy one and it becomes a family heirloom.
Thanks for that very important response. Yeah, I can make some strategic decisions for the future now.
You're welcome.
So moving slowly into the products realm, there is a whole kind of thing around customer experience. And by the way, I have a confession here to make that I also don't have a driving license either. And I've been this kind of guy who's always said to my wife, she's been always kind of like shaming me for not having a driving license. And, she would say to me, like, when are you going to get your driving license? And I said, when the full autonomy is a standard kind of thing. In other words, I won't need it. So
you are the future.
Yeah. But I've always been absolutely fascinated by customer experience of cars and transport. And so the question then is, what is the customer experience of what's it going to be like, and is that really the product here that we're looking at, and why is it perhaps not changing as much as it perhaps ought to, considering these kind of trends? And I've been waiting for this for 20 years now, and it's like I'm still thinking, like, my gosh, I might have to get a driving license.
So Jason, you can tell your wife that you are the future, that John Fuggles has said, you're actually going to be a role model.
I've been saying that to her, and she just says, like, oh, shut up.
So, I mean, a car has changed very, very little, since Mr. Benz and a few of his chums got together. The first petrol station in Germany was 100 years ago. They haven't changed. You still drive till you run out of petrol. And by the way, it was invented because his wife wanted to go and see a friend, and by the time she got there, she ran out of petrol. So he built a petrol station in that town. That hasn't changed.
That's love. That's love.
That's love. Yeah, build your wife a petrol station. There you go. So that hasn't changed. A car hasn't changed. It has, give or take, 4 seats. Some more, some less, but give or take, and usually 4 wheels, not always, an engine, and fundamentally, it's a car is no different to a horse and cart. If you look at the very first cars, they were a horse and cart with the horse detached and an engine put underneath. Nothing's changed. Technology is changing that, but the technology is in the powertrain. It's around batteries, not combustion engines, but it's still fundamentally the same thing. We see all these beautiful futuristic cars. They cost a lot to manufacture. And customers aren't always ready. Jason, you mentioned Tesla earlier. Look at their new wagon. It's like something from the future. A chunk of people love it. A chunk of people absolutely hate it. So you've got to take the customer with you. But actually, the biggest change in a car is inside. If you get in a reasonably spec car, I'm not talking about something exotic, you expect a standard, MP3, DVD, sat-nav, Bluetooth, heated seats, electric mirrors, parking sensors, ABS, airbags. If you don't get that, you want to know why. Most of that didn't exist 10 years ago. The pace of change is moving faster and faster and faster. So that kind of technology is being driven by the technology people. Apple CarPlay, it's a tech company doing stuff for cars, and that's the change. Google are getting into cars as well. But at the end of the day, it's still a sedan, right? You're going to go back to the original days of sedans. Somebody sitting in a chair and a load of people carrying it. It hasn't changed in 3,000 years. We've put a motor in it and got rid of the people. We put wheels under the bars, but it's the same thing. It will only change when the dynamics of how we use it change.
So, recently I this little bit of bragging here, but we won this Ford Mobility Hackathon, which was about car space or curb space, even curb space. And Ford had developed this curb space API, and then they were getting a bunch of people to hack on the what that can be utilized for. And the kind of trend has been, I've done a little bit of work in Jaguar Land Rover accelerator before, and there it was about innovations around delivering to your boot of the car, various kind of hiring for a day, for an hour, insurance that's, some temporary, and also can be used by 3 or 4 people, all these kind of things. So it seems like the system bit of the overall company experience is playing a major role in becoming the product, right? So I might, as you were saying, I might want to jump on, let's say if we take something like Mercedes-Benz, because I'm thinking also around brand affinity, right? That Mercedes-Benz could be a company that could provide some sort of door-to-door transport solution one way or another for no matter what. Perhaps even including things like bikes, because let's say bikes are becoming electric or so on. So why doesn't Mercedes-Benz have a bike company that can say, well, hey, why don't you ride on these shorter distances? We'll track that for some way or another, maybe give you some insurance premiums if you cycle more with Mercedes-Benz, let's say. And then on the longer trips, you either hire something for a day or rent something that may or may not include a chauffeur, if wife's not around, in my case. Yep. So, these kind of things, and that become a lot more systemic mobility provision and a product, really. Do you see this happening with companies like, let's say, Mercedes-Benz, and perhaps even, Tesla seems to be heading in that direction, but yeah.
I think the industry is heading in that direction. I think different companies are coming in different ways. Potentially some companies are not going to do all of it, but they will partner with people that do. We talked about GM earlier, partnering with some of these kind of companies. Ford is in the same. JLR in the UK, you mentioned, they're doing the same. Let's give an example. I leave the Royal Automobile Club in Pall Mall. I step out onto the street, and I might want to go to the tube station, Green Park or whatever. And it's raining, and I don't want to walk. So I'll use an app on my phone, and it will tell me there's an electric bike just parked around the corner, or an electric scooter. Why not? Just park around the corner. I'll book it. I'll go there. Touch my phone on it and get on. Or actually, I don't want to go there. I want to go to the main railway station. So electric bike or scooter won't do. I'll just get a little pod, and that will take me there. And I'll tap on my phone, and it will say the same thing. Or this time, it's late, and I just want to go all the way home. It's a much longer drive. I'll need a car. Same thing. That's where it all starts to come together, and where mobility replaces cars. Now, in that environment, you could have the bike companies providing that service, and that already exists in London. Electric scooters are not yet road legal in the UK, but if that happens, there'll be a company step in and do that. And then potentially you'd have, a car company would either have automated pods, or it would be, at least in the short term, an Uber driver. Well, the only thing that's stopping that is there's a little bit of regulation in terms of the scooters in that example. But that's the only thing stopping it is somebody's not developed an app yet and gone and had a conversation with Uber and gone and had a conversation with the London bike people. Maybe I've just given away an idea. If anyone wants to steal this idea, please do. But that's all possible to do, right? The technology isn't standing in the way. It's the demand for people. How many people would like that kind of service, and how deliverable is that across the country? In SW1, dead easy. Could you do that in the middle of a small town in Oxfordshire? Probably not. It becomes a bit more challenging. So these things are all going to happen, and they are potentially happening right now. You just haven't seen them yet, and they're not finished yet, but they're happening. The idea that Mercedes-Benz rewards you for cycling to work is an interesting one. I'm not sure that would happen, but I get the point. We need to embrace the idea of mobility and forget the idea of cars, and how that works.
I'd just like to bounce off that, John. So I see what you and Jason are saying in terms of the industry going towards mobility. I've even talked about this myself. This is kind of more of an emotional thing, not data-based. But, I still feel there will be a trend towards ownership of cars. That's never going to go away. I think it's still going to be a strong percentage of the population, right? So recently I was with a friend of mine. He's a very experienced mechanic. And, we were playing around with the OBD2 port, which actually allows you to access the car data. And so what I found quite interesting was we had this, so he's really kitted up. He has all the manufacturer diagnostic boxes, etc. And we had this really terrible looking software that allowed us to actually access the data that was emitted by the car. And I came to the realization, and correct me if I'm wrong, the reason the software was so terrible was because the manufacturer, the creator of the software, the company that made it, basically had to go through and normalize the OBD signals from every manufacturer into the interface,
Yes.
which explained why we had access to some gauges, but there wasn't actually data for that. So in terms of products, what I'd like to ask you is, what do you see in terms of potential, either like self-data hacking, which is a smaller percentage of the population to which I'm sensitive, or just like larger scale use of this data that cars have, normalization of this data ecosystem?
So first of all, the manufacturers want to keep control of the data and who has access to the data, because they have an obligation to the manufacturers. They also don't want you doing slightly dodgy things with the car. I'm actually working with a startup that's trying to do something similar to that, but purely for electric cars and charging, and to interface with the car to actually improve how efficiently you charge and recharge the car. It's quite an involved project. But so there are people already doing that. The OBD port and access to that, yes, the problem isn't the problem is getting the data out in a usable format, and the manufacturers don't want you getting too much of that. But you go way back to the Mclaren F1, which is an iconic car. Those cars, if they broke down, a mechanic would turn up with a laptop by the side of the road and plug it in. Nowadays, you obviously do it with a mobile phone, but in those days you plugged it in. When that happened, people were scratching their heads going, hang on a minute, there's a man with a computer fixing my car. They just couldn't get their head around it. Now, actually, if you see a mechanic without a computer, you wonder, is he actually doing all of that he should, or is he just doing some of it? So the OBD access to data is about protecting their IP in some respect, if you like. It's no different to you talked about Apple earlier. You can download the apps, you can get your data off, but you try getting the really sexy stuff out of Apple, you can't. They don't want you to. Right? That's not what they want you to go play with. So there is a need for some of these companies to come together, and at the same time, there's going to be people trying to hack into it. Where that gets us, I don't know.
It's interesting. That reminds me of another hackathon I attended, which was organized by Honda. It was called Power of Dreams, which is their brand tagline. And so because it was Honda, we thought the way we would win that is by, and this was like a bunch of years ago, so maybe 5 or 6, maybe even 7 years ago. So at the time, the kind of notion of smart car wasn't really that kind of popular. So we created like a prototype, this app, that was to do with controlling the heat inside the car, set the music on before you come in and all that kind of stuff. And then we spoke to one of the Honda engineers and said, to what extent can we tap into the data of the car? And he said, we can. Well, I've got to call this engineer from the factory to bring this like massive rig that plugs it in. And I was like, hold on. No. We're talking about like a smartphone accessing. It was like, oh, that's not going to happen in a million years. That's what he was telling us. And the guy who ended up winning that hackathon just basically made a productivity app for teams to, collaborate with, which is like, okay, how's Honda, really, playing a role in that? But that was an interesting thing. What's to me interesting to see is how is all this going to get tied in, right? Because without a kind of like standardized data interchanges and some sort of APIs and actually more of the kind of softwareization of the industry, how is the industry going to move forward in your view, John?
Well, so first of all, as we move away from internal combustion engines, there's less really critical data, right? A lot of that data that you were talking about was about engine and that kind of stuff, which they don't want their competitors knowing about. So as we move away from that, it becomes less need to protect data. I'm not sure there is a desire too much in the part of the car manufacturers to combine and collaborate to have like an open system. I think that takes away some competitive advantage. So the idea that if you need an application to be able to remotely start your car and drive it to your driveway so that you can walk out the door and get in it, if you've got a Ford, that'll be a Ford app. If you've got a Vauxhall, that'll be a Vauxhall app or a PSA app, right? There won't be one app. Where that potentially will change is I think you'll see some of the car companies will get very close with some of the tech companies. One of the cars I'm passionate about, the Nissan GTR, the technology in there, the screen in the middle, the MFD, that was all built by Sony. So you're going to see that kind of stuff coming together. You're going to see, the Googles of this world potentially signing a partnership with a big car manufacturer, and you're going to get in, and it's going to be a flat screen display, and it's going to have Google Chrome on it, which is going to, present all the information you need about the car. Probably won't let you surf the web while you're driving. That might not necessarily be a good thing, but I think that's going to happen because it's one less thing for the manufacturer to develop, and they can hand that to an expert. In the same way that the car manufacturers don't make tires. Making tires is an incredibly, designing, developing new technologies, making them stickier so you can stop quicker, but making them less abrasive so they're more efficient. How do you do that? So tire technology is fascinating, and it's just not something the car manufacturers get into. So what else is on that list that potentially you go, actually, you know what, we'll get some other experts to do this, and I think that's where that will change.
So that brings us into the money side of things. What's going on with the money in this industry, John?
Well, a lot of car manufacturers are losing money, that's for sure, especially right now. We had the big financial crash, and there were times where some of the biggest manufacturers in the world would just had no value. The debt they were carrying, usually related to pension schemes and such, was more than the value of the car company. And to a certain extent, they've never recovered. You're seeing huge bailouts or support for the airline industry. I think that's following with the car industry, because after we come out of lockdown and people return to normal, they will second think whether they want to change the car so often, whether they need that many cars, whether they're doing that many miles. So there's two schools of thought on the pre-owned or second-hand market, and I've spoken to people thinking both sides. One who think that's going to be relatively flat or decline because people are just going, actually we won't buy another car. Other people who just think it's going to take off because people are going to be less reluctant to spend more money on a new car. The other side of it, on the new cars, there are different opinions, but the overwhelming opinion is it's going to take a long, long time to recover, if ever it does fully recover, and we're going to see a slowdown. That just puts more pressure on the manufacturers. Now you've got factories closed around the world, and don't forget, for the most part, car manufacturers are big companies, and they have production capabilities in multiple countries. First thing they'll do, they'll look after their own, right? German car companies are reluctant to close factories in Germany. French car companies are reluctant to close factories in France, and so on and so on and so forth. But you might see car manufacturing plants in other countries mothballed or just closed down completely to reduce their production capability. If they all do that, that's better for the industry. It's probably not so better for local employees.
So question on the money theme then, John, right? So, I mean, up for the last century, car manufacturers have been companies that make money by producing and selling cars. Pretty simple recipe, right? More recently, they've become their own bank by selling financial products that are especially profitable on people that have issues with repaying the loan. They could take the car, and that's a whole industry in itself in the US, which is, doing car loans at outrageous rates, repoing the car, redoing it back out, right?
Yep.
But what are the sources of revenue tomorrow for manufacturers?
Well, gosh, if you're manufacturing a car, someone still has to buy it. You still have to sell the product. The squeeze is coming because if there's less people buying them, and you talked about the finance element of car industry. 2 years ago, some of the big car companies pulled out of direct finance, and they handed their finance book over to banks or finance houses because they could see where this was going. Look, whether it's a beautiful brand new Aston Martin parked on my driveway, or whether I use an app and a little 4-seater pod no bigger than a smart car turns up and whisks me off to the station, somebody still needs to pay for that as an asset. Somebody needs to buy it, maintain it, etc., etc. I suspect what's happened is what will happen is there'll be more money in selling those pods because there'll be greater demand, and they'll be easy to maintain as well. And the other thing is, if they break down, that's okay. There's loads of them on the street. You just take them off and fix them and put them back again. So I think that's where they have to go. If they don't embrace that technology, they become dinosaurs. Dinosaurs don't rule the earth anymore.
Yeah, dinosaurs became oil.
Yeah, there's an irony. Yeah, true, very true. Which hopefully we need less of. You're right. I mean, different industries can diversify. The technology can manifest itself in different ways. You can move into different markets. Other industries are doing smart things. I mean, but the car industry, there's only so far you can take that. Are they going to go and produce boats? Well, no, not really. I mean, you don't get me wrong. Lamborghini would argue one of their biggest competitors is a yacht company, but they're not going to go and make yachts, right? Are they going to go and make aircraft? Actually, Honda are looking at that, right? But there is only so far you can go. They're not going to go out and whereas the technology companies, like Tesla, which is a technology company, like Google, like Amazon, like Apple, are moving into the car space, shall we call that, i.e. not making cars, but they could very, very well do one day. It's very difficult for someone like Ferrari to suddenly invent a watch or a phone or a smartwatch or a phone. Right? It's really difficult. So I'm not sure the car industry has much room to move. I think it just has to get smarter and identify the partners that it wants to work with, rather than not find new markets.
So I'd love to just bounce off of that, because that kind of makes me think of growth. You mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, John, that car industry is basically static, right? And so what you just told us in terms of, the pods, the maintenance, it seems to me like, if we're going to talk about growth, that car companies are going to move from being a direct to consumer proposition to being a business to business entity in the value chain, and selling initial assets as capital, but then really making money from ongoing operational recurring revenue agreements with the end service providers, such as tech companies or cities, etc., that will actually be leasing out the mobility to the end user. That's my thought. What are your thoughts about that?
Side note on that. Like, I mean, Elon Musk has said that, for example, for Tesla, they would get to a point where no longer do they manufacture new cars, but are getting into more around optimizing how this can be leased out, rented, shared, all that kind of stuff, and maintained in a sort of ongoing way. So is that what you see, John?
Yeah, what's wrong? Car as a service, right? Yeah, we talk the software industry not that long ago. You bought a license. Hardly anyone sells licenses nowadays. It's software as a service. The car industry will be the same. A car as a service. At the moment we have that. It's a taxi. It's Uber. It's a seat on a train, right? You pay to go from there to there. So why doesn't the car industry do the same? Well, it is. It is moving in that direction. So you already have car hire companies, van hire companies where you pay by the hour. In the airline industry, you've got Rolls-Royce does a thing called power by the hour. When you get on your when we're allowed to get back on an aircraft to fly around the world to go on holiday, if that's not environmentally damaging and we get told off for it. But
shame on you for even thinking of that.
Well, I was thinking about other people, not me. But when you get on that aircraft, the Rolls-Royce engine sitting next to you, when that's off, the airline isn't paying for that. But as soon as it starts to turn and they drive you down the runway and down the perimeter track and up the runway, then they're paying. As soon as they get the other end and land and turn the engine off, they stop paying. So if Rolls-Royce can do that with something that is, if you think about the cost of an aero engine, huge, and you think about the complexity of maintaining it, that's purely a financial decision. So there's no reason why the car industry couldn't do the same. The problem with the car industry is if I have a car sitting on my driveway and I don't use it for a month, whoever are not going to get paid. So the challenge for them isn't the process of charging me for every mile. It's to make sure that when I'm not using it, at least someone else please use it. And we're moving in that direction. And people like Uber are significantly important in that process, because the data that Uber has will tell you at my local railway station how many kinds of cars they would have, with how many seats, with what range, with what configuration, etc., etc., etc. And that would dictate, which cars are parked in there to be used as pods. I keep using the word pod, which has a certain image with people, but I think we will eventually get there. And that's why those companies have the valuation, because they hold the key to what needs to be built in the future.
So there's two things that come to mind there. One is that regarding the Rolls-Royce engines, I have a very good friend who's like a consultant to aircraft industry, and he says that 40% of the aircraft cost is in the engines, which is quite staggering. And the engine is made out of 20,000 parts, believe it or not. The reason why I was saying things earlier on that I was saying around interoperability is because one thing that I can somehow see, and it's sort of like a gut feel based on all these kind of observations that I've been making. I'm sort of like a massive fan of Tesla, from like where are they going next and all that kind of stuff. But basically, one of the ways I see the industry growing going forward is for the manufacturers worldwide that have built quite a staggering really capacity and capability of manufacturing cars and parts and all that kind of stuff, kind of having to somehow band together to produce and keep producing and maintaining this fleet of maybe autonomous vehicles, okay, that end customers end up not so much caring about which brand it is, but how well does it work for my experience, however short or long the journey is, right? So for the manufacturers of the cars to survive and perhaps grow and thrive and maintain themselves, they would need to band together with other manufacturers to provide that seamless end-to-end journey experience for the end customers.
Yeah, but that's not the game they're in, and that's quite a big task to take on. So in the UK, you've got people like Transport Systems Catapult, which are working with local authorities to try and change the way cities are built, if you like, or the way that cities evolve, so there's less cars. Now, if they can get that organised, and they can then go back to the manufacturers and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, then they become the aggregator for the service. You know, if you go around, London, there are, bicycles that you can just swipe a card, get on, and away you go. Well, the people who make the bikes don't run the system. It's a different thing. So why would the car manufacturers want to get into running the systems? Find a municipal authority and say, okay, you run the system. You tell us where we can park the cars. You tell us what kind of cars. Oh no, don't worry, our data partner is going to do that. We'll tell you what cars, and you run it, okay? And then you buy the car off us, and then you sell it as a service. The problem with that is there's a lot of cost. The second problem with that is you've got to take the people with you in terms of changing the way they want to travel. If you suddenly shut all of Oxford city centre to traffic and said there are no cars allowed at all, one, it would be beautiful, it would be brilliant, it would be how the city should be in my mind, and I'm a car guy. I think if you did that, people would still want to get around, and they'd need something to replace their car for the slightly longer journeys. So you need to have something that's in place. So it's a chicken and egg. Do you shut off the traffic and then build it, or do you build it and incur all that cost and then one day just stop everyone from entering? And where are they going to park their cars when they get there? Suddenly you're going to need real estate in large clumps, which we now see in Park and Drive. So it's a significant change. Where you'll see it happen first is in new cities. If we were to build Milton Keynes again in 10 years' time, it would be fundamentally different. I mean, it just wouldn't look like the same Milton Keynes we have today. So new cities potentially are the easiest way forward, because you can build it with that in mind. Older cities, a bit more of a struggle, but it requires authorities, manufacturers, aggregators, finance, and the will of the people. That's a lot of things to get lined up.
Yeah. Which is actually the nature of the whole redesigning humanity mission. Like, I've foreseen this like 4 years ago, where it's like, we're not really going to make ways forward in any kind of meaningful way, shape or form, unless we start actually a lot more collaborating, like across different industries and different sectors, and like everything's become a lot more smarter and softwareized and so on. Such a fantastic topic. I'm so glad we had this conversation. I'm sure we could go for another 2-3 hours. We're way overblown our aim of 30 minutes, but I think it's well worth going through that imaginary sort of barrier. John, where can people find you, and what are you looking for the most at the moment?
Sure. My name is John Fuggles. I own a company called Mission 23. So john@mission23.com is usually the easiest way to get hold of me. Just companies going through a change that requires growth. I work in growth, so that's turnarounds, that's startups, that's companies that have plateaued. How do you get to the next level? And it's not just about, let's run a sales campaign, let's employ more salespeople. It's a strategic approach to how do you develop and evolve your business. I genuinely believe that all the really cool projects just begin with an open-minded conversation. So if anyone wants to contact me, I'll have a conversation with them. Who knows where it leads? I mean, that's how you and I ended up on this conversation. So
yeah, I mean, Mo, what's my neighbor like, man?
I mean, great. To be honest, I have not particularly much industry of the automotive industry, so it's really just good learning all this stuff today, and it's going with some ideas. But particularly, I think this insight that we had today of manufacturers going from sellers to the consumer to service providers for the tech titans, is really just another proof of the power of data today in this evolving society. Yeah, and thank you for the strategic advice about how to manage my future Audi purchase, John. I'll keep that in mind.
Guys, I'm still sitting in this kind of future consumer, who wants to press a button and be able to get a bike, whatever, yacht, even if necessary, for a quick sort of journey on the sea, and that will be maintained through one app. And it would be amazing to work with companies like Mercedes-Benz and so on at least plotting out some of that vision for the future. Guys, thank you so much for participating, and reach out to us all, if you want to speak to John and grow your company. Absolutely. If you want to maintain and further keep track of how your company's working, design company software is ready there to help you with all that. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening. And thanks, John, for participating and giving us the wisdom of all ages.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.